What we do here is go back.
Hi, and welcome to Mr. Toyama's AP World History. This is Chapter 22, Transoceanic Encounters and Global Connections. As usual, here's our kind of overview for the chapter. Before 1500, there was considerable cross-cultural interaction between Europe and Asia, and to a lesser extent, with sub-Saharan Africa. With the voyages of discovery in the 15th century, these contacts accelerated and become global in reach. Russian adventurers built an empire that stretched across Eurasia and began to explore in the Pacific Ocean basin. Meanwhile, the Chinese and the Ottomans ventured into and explored the Indian Ocean basin. The impact of the European contact on previously isolated societies of the Americas and the Pacific Islands was profound and devastating. This chapter considers the motives and methods of European trade and exploration between the 15th and 18th centuries. Some common themes of this era include the following. Mixed motives. European explorers acted from a complex mix of greed, daring, and missionary zeal. Christian princes such as Prince Henry of Portugal and Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain underwrote voyages to expand Christianity. Equally compelling were the profits to be made in the spice trade, especially if Arab intermediaries could be eliminated. New technologies used in navigation. From Arab traders, the Portuguese borrowed the astrolabe and the cross-staff and used these tools to determine their north-south position. Other new technologies included the magnetic compass, more flexible combination of sails, improved shipbuilding, cannons, and more accurate navigational charts. Adventure. Curiosity and a sense of adventure also drew Europeans out into the world. Between 1500 and 1800, European mariners charted across the ocean, seas, and coasts of the entire globe. Important geographic questions were resolved: the circumference of the Earth, the quest for a northwest passage across North America, and the patterns of winds and currents. And finally, the Columbian Exchange. Contact with European diseases was a demographic catastrophe for the populations of the Americas and the Pacific Islands, who usually suffered 80% to 90% mortality within the first generation. The cross-cultural exchange was more beneficial for Europeans who gained significant new food crops. All right, so to start off our lecture, I kind of want to give you guys a little bit of a setup here. And what I wanted to do was talk about a recommendation for your notes. For this chapter, it's very heavy on people and what those people specifically did. So if you want to pull out a separate sheet of paper to take alongside of your notes, I would recommend drawing a little chart having these 5 different little columns. And I would make enough room so you have 10 people and 2 organizations that you need to kind of cover. In the first column, I put the name of the explorer or the organization, the accomplishments or discoveries, or what were they actually doing while they were circumnavigating the globe, or were they going to the New World, or were they looking for certain goods. I would also talk about the years active, or make sure to make a note of those years active, or when they were doing their most work. And then the country of origin, where did these people or organizations come from? And finally, there's some other notes I would leave just in case there's some other information you need to write down. First up, we have Portuguese exploration. The Portuguese were the first to be major movers and shakers in the world of exploration, mainly because of one reason. They're technically landlocked with the rest of Europe. If you think about where Portugal is on the Iberian Peninsula, it has no way to really access Europe except for through Spain. And at this time, Spain had set up different tariffs, different traveling restrictions on the Portuguese trade. And if you're Portugal, you're going to lose a lot of money through this kind of tariff system and through this trade network that's running through Spain. So the Portuguese are going to look around to try and find a way to get on boats and circumnavigate or circumvent the Spanish influence over their country as a whole in their interaction with Europe. Additionally, Portugal is very close by being on the Iberian Peninsula to northern Africa, a place that was already at this point known for its certain types of goods. A lot of gold had been found in Africa, diamonds as well, and precious gems. But mostly the Portuguese originally were using it for fishing. Portuguese cuisine has a lot of fish in it, and as a result, the Portuguese were looking for new food sources to feed their growing population. Additionally, they had a sense of land hunger. This is the start of what we would know as like colonization or colonialism. The Portuguese are looking to expand their empire or their hold over the world because Portugal is pretty much stuck in its predetermined borders because of its bordering with Spain. Spain had already established its size and its shape, and the same with Portugal. And so for the Portuguese, there wasn't really any area of that peninsula that they were sitting on that they could actually claim for their own, so they had to look elsewhere outside of their area. If you think about how this might be weird, just imagine the United States. In the United States, we have the contiguous 48 states of the United States, and then we have two kind of random states. We have Alaska and Hawaii. For us, it doesn't seem very weird that we have 50 states. Alaska and Hawaii are part of that state, and we would consider ourselves one country, even though it's like a 3-4 hour plane flight to Hawaii and a pretty long plane flight to Alaska. So this land hunger drove the Portuguese to go out and look for more land, and in addition to that land, they're getting more goods as a result of this. They discovered the Azores and the Madeiras Islands in the Atlantic Ocean. They pretty much determined that that's now their claim. The Portuguese were very good at establishing colonies, and they were also starting the trend that we would come to see later on in world history of going out, and when you establish a colony and you claim it for your own self, your country now owns that section of the world, and you have influence, you have hegemony, you have dominance culturally over the people of that area, and that's why a lot of the New World speaks some of the languages from the Old World even to this day. And the Portuguese were very concerned with the acquisition of land to plant sugarcane. Sugarcane is a very difficult crop to grow because it needs a lot of water, and it also needs a kind of warmer climate. So the only places on the earth that really facilitate this process are like Southeast Asia and what will eventually be known as the Caribbean. Well, to get to Southeast Asia, it's a very long trip. You have to go all the way around Africa, which at this point was not able to be done through like bypassing through the Suez Canal, which is in Egypt, which is a later development. So we have the Portuguese looking for sugarcane, which is a very profitable crop because, you know, who doesn't like sugar? So they're looking for a lot as they go out into the world. Next, we have the lure of trade. Maritime routes to Asia. I mean, if you think about it, we've talked extensively about the Silk Road network, the Sub-Saharan network, and the Indian Ocean Basin network. But if you look at the interconnectedness of all these networks and the way that goods are traded and travel along these routes, maritime routes are relatively safer in terms of you can put lots of goods on a boat. The boat doesn't need a lot of manual labor. You don't have to physically move the boat. The winds move the boat. The ocean current moves the boat. And if you do it right, you can get a lot of money and profits based on the amount of goods you're able to trade. And you can move quickly across these lands. Many of these routes had, at this point, set up trade stops where you had to actually pay some taxes as you travel through areas. You need to look for protection from raiders, bandits. Whereas the maritime trade routes to Asia were highly profitable because you're able to really go around all those hindrances to your profits. Spices, silk, and porcelain. Again, this is from the Emporia in India. This is silk coming from China and porcelain. These are highly sought after goods for many Europeans, and they're very profitable. So if you're a country or you're a trader, you're looking for a way to increase your profits and basically get goods for your people. The Silk Roads are more dangerous since the spread of the bubonic plague. The Black Death or the bubonic plague we talked about last chapter, it ends up killing large sections of Eurasia, the Eurasian continent, and as you travel through sections, you might pick up some of these germs, some of these diseases. So many of these places that were once thriving and growing have a very large drop-off in population, and you need to find a new way to really get your goods to where you want them to go without really interacting with so many germs. And when you're on a boat, you're not really interacting with a ton of germs. The prices and the profits increase as a result of this. If there's a lot less people, there's a lot less people who can manufacture the goods, who know how to manufacture the goods. One of the famous examples is in Europe during the bubonic plague, there's this idea of metal workers or iron workers or blacksmiths. And if you think about it, that's a hard craft. Many of us could not just tomorrow pull out a kiln or a furnace and start hammering on iron to make swords. And so that's a knowledge or a skill that's passed down from generations through guilds. And by having the way the guild system was set up, many of the people who died weren't able to pass on some of that information. And the prices of those goods that were very delicate or intricate or required a lot of labor, they're going to rise because there's not as many people to do it. And as a result, when there's a scarcity of goods, this is an economic principle, the profits are going to increase as a result. The reason why, for example, those fancy Back to the Future Nikes that like lace themselves are like 10 grand, or I don't know, they're super expensive, is because there's a limited quantity of them. If there was tons of them, hundreds of thousands of them, there wouldn't probably be as high a price for it. But as a result of having a limited run, they're going to be more expensive. And so you can see that economic principle play out even today. Indian pepper, Chinese ginger, increasingly essential to the diet of wealthy Europeans. If you think about some of the most important things that we do for cooking, we have a lot of spices we just throw into different dishes. You could go to the store now, and I know when I go to the store, I always look at this big rack, and there's tons of spices. There's like hundreds of them just in little jars, and you can buy them, and some of them are really expensive, some of them are really cheap. And we live here in Cerritos, right next to a very famous section of Artesia that is like Little India, or it's like the Indian Quarter. And there are whole grocery stores and whole stores dedicated just to spices that come from the Indian subcontinent. And when you're looking at that diversity and the plurality of spices, you're going to see that creates different dishes. Any of you who like any kind of like very spice-heavy food are going to realize like it doesn't really taste the same without the certain spices. And especially for the European wealthy, they were getting very used to having Indian pepper, Chinese ginger, and other spices to flavor their food, and they wanted that. And when you have money and you don't really care, you're willing to pay any prices. And as a trader, you would see the profits in that. African gold, ivory, and slaves are a huge part of this lure of trade. African gold, obviously, gold as a commodity for trade. Ivory becoming a very big staple in goods that are longer term. Ivory is a very sturdy material. We have ivory that's hundreds of years old because it's basically just very large chunks of bone. It's not going to fall apart very quickly, and it's a way to show off your wealth. And finally, slaves. The Europeans were looking to get slaves to work in not just their individual homes, as was the case in Britain all the way up until early 19th century, 18th century. We're going to look at it, and the slaves are going to be used for working on these plantations and these haciendas so that the goods can be created. The Portuguese especially, the Spanish especially, are going to try this slavery process with the natives, and it's not going to really work, so they're going to look to Africa, who had already interacted with European diseases and were less likely to succumb to things like the bubonic plague and smallpox, which we'll look at a little later. There was also missionary efforts. Franciscan, Dominican missionaries are sent to India, Central Asia, and China. If we go back to the foundations of Christianity, one of the last things that Jesus tells his disciples are that I will go and prepare a place for you, but what I want you to do is go out and spread the gospel, tell people about my message from Judea, Jerusalem, to the very ends of the earth. And so many Christians took this as a charge from Jesus to go out and spread the good news of his message, or the gospel. And many Christians to this day still believe this process. And by sending out missionaries to India, Central Asia, and China, many of the missionaries are interacting with people who had never heard about the story of Jesus or the Gospels as they were being taught about in Europe and the Middle East. And this is going to drive a lot of them, and especially the monarchs and regents who believe that they are helping the Christian church by spreading the gospel. There was also violent efforts interacting with the Crusades. We talked a little bit about the Crusades, but the Crusades was basically the Europeans believing that the Muslim expansion in the years after Muhammad's death kind of dominated that large section of what we would know as like the Middle East today. And they believed that they needed to kind of go out and try and reconvert or get back some of those people that lived in the Holy Land. And they wanted to kind of go after the Crusaders who were fighting to convert people to Christianity. And so this is going to draw people into that process of migration and moving around. And there's also this idea of the Reconquista. The Spanish, indigenous Spanish Europeans were very actively pushing out the Muslims, and eventually will win that war of pushing the Muslims back to the northern tip of Spain. Especially after we talked a little bit about the Battle of Tours. That begins kind of to signal the decline of the Muslim influence in the Spanish Iberian Peninsula. They get technology through exploration. First, the Chinese rudder is introduced in the 12th century. The rudder is the thing on the back of the boat that helps it steer, so it's very good to help kind of, as well as using sails, you're kind of forcing the boat to turn in a certain way, and that helps to more navigate more efficiently. Square sails are replaced by triangular lateen sails. Square sails are like big pieces of paper. If any of you have ever flown a kite, most kites are not in the shape of a square, unless they're like those weird three-dimensional ones. But if you think about flying a piece of paper, it's kind of catching the wind from all different directions, whereas triangular sails are able to be very well manipulated. They're able to catch the wind in certain ways, and they're able to work better with crosswinds, especially the winds that are going like across your bow, like perpendicular to your boat. So it's really efficient when even you're trying not to go the direction the wind wants you to go, you can still move in the direction you want to go. They also get navigational instruments such as the astrolabe and the cross staff. These are things that are able to determine positions on the Earth, north, south. They're also able to give explorers a more accurate understanding of where they are on the ocean and how far they are based on the stars at night. They also learn a lot about the knowledge of winds, currents. Winds, obviously, are the wind that are on the ocean, and currents are the movement of the water underneath the ocean. There's a very famous one. Many of you have probably seen Finding Nemo, the turtle that Nemo jumps on Nemo's dad and Dory jump on the back of. That's a current. It kind of is an underwater like wind flow that pushes the ocean in a very specific direction. And by knowing about the differences of winds and currents, the Portuguese are actually able to figure out what's called the Volta do Mar, or the return through the sea. There's a picture here on the left of, if you look at like Lagos, right? You can see that this is the western coast of northern Africa. You can see the Portuguese go all the way down to Arguin, and I probably butchered it, but Arguin. And by hugging the coast all straight down, following the Canary Current, they're able to be pushed very efficiently. And then they actually have to go from Alguin out of Cape Blanc towards like the west, which is counterintuitive to what normal people would think of, returning back home. And if you're a math person, you know that the fastest point or the shortest distances between 2 points is a straight line. Well, in the specifics of sea travel with the Portuguese, this is not the case. The fastest way back home was actually to head west first, and then right about the Azores, you would grab the Portugal current and ride the Portugal current back home. This cut down on time traveling. It also increased profits, and this made the Portuguese one of the wealthiest and most efficient country during this time, because of the knowledge of these types of natural events. If you look here, we have a map of the wind and current patterns in the world's ocean. You can see naturally the wind moves in different directions, and the North Pacific current, the North Equatorial current, you can see in the Pacific Ocean. You can see the Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic. So there's all these different currents that are running under the water. There's wind that's moving under the water or above the water, and you're getting this knowledge through your exploration. And of course, by trying to increase your profits, you're trying to use any advantage you can, and getting your goods to port as quickly and efficiently as possible is a goal of many of these traders. Next, we have Portuguese Breakthroughs. Prince Henry of Portugal from 1394 to 1460. He is a famous explorer, promoted the exploration of West African coast, and established fortified trading posts. One of the things the Portuguese need to do is not just have their boats show up on a shore and just assume that the natives want to trade with them. They build these trading posts so that the natives of Africa on the western coast can actually bring their goods to one spot. The Portuguese can bring some of their goods from Europe, and they can do trade. And it can make this process efficient, and is fortifying it with stone and building basically big forts. They're able to create a network and a system that's really in the benefit of the Portuguese. We then get in 1488, Bartolomeu Dias. He rounds the Cape of Good Hope, which is in the south of Africa, and enters the Indian Ocean basin. It's a really big deal because he's figured out the currents, he's figured out the winds. He's able to do this very efficiently, and getting into the Indian Ocean basin, now he's found a new route outside of the Silk Roads that he's able to really get goods and other things through and back from the Indian Ocean basin. Storms and restless crew force his return, though. Basically, it's very difficult to travel that long on open ocean. Storms are unpredictable, especially back during this time. And his restless crew, traveling that far took many, many, many months. And when you're used to going basically a month or two and coming back on the Western African leg of the journey for the Portuguese, you're going to get kind of frustrated that your captain keeps saying, let's go farther and farther and farther. And so his crew forces him to return. We then get Vasco da Gama, who reaches India by this route in 1497. And by 1500, there is a trading post at Calcutta in India. So the Portuguese are really the first movers and shakers. They're very influential at this point. They have 3 different explorers here that have created a vast network that goes around Spain. It gets their goods back to them, and it makes life for the Portuguese a lot better because they're able to increase their profits and basically just creates a network that they get to control and own outside of other European powers. All right, so next up we have Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506. Christopher Columbus, very controversial figure in world history. He actually believed the Earth was smaller than originally estimated. It's debatable whether Europeans had a widespread knowledge of the Earth being round at this point, but for certain people like Columbus and like a lot of these explorers, they believed and knew that the world was a round orb. And so by this understanding, Christopher Columbus had this idea that he would travel west to make it to India, thinking that the route was shorter. He estimated, for example, that Japan was approximately 2,500 miles west of the Canary Islands when it was actually 10,000 miles, which is a big problem when you're doing navigation like that. The Portuguese kings did not want to fund his proposed westward trip because the Portuguese saw it as a waste of time. The Portuguese had already set up their western coast of Africa trade network, around the Cape of Good Hope, through into the Indian Ocean basin. So they actually saw this as not something that would benefit them. However, Fernando and Isabel of Spain and some Italian bankers are willing to underwrite his voyage, believing that it can gain back some of the superiority that the Spanish had over the Portuguese, realizing that trade was a very necessary and important part of their empire. Christopher Columbus sailed westward along the Atlantic Ocean and ended up in what we would call today the Bahamas, Cuba, the Caribbean area. He discovers the island of Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Many people think that Christopher Columbus was, this hero. We have in our culture, especially in the Americas, Christopher Columbus Day. Many of you probably have it off. We at Cerritos didn't. And so it's just kind of one of those things that people debate. And here we're going to talk about it a little because Christopher Columbus, from all accounts, was really just looking for fame and money. And there's nothing wrong with looking for fame and money, but in his efforts to do so, Christopher Columbus had discovered a very efficient way to do this, and he was willing to do anything to get what he wanted. So the brutality of Christopher Columbus is recounted in a lot of primary sources and in original material that we would look at in class or look at maybe just on the internet. You could read about some of his treatment of the Taíno people. So for many people, Christopher Columbus has the image in their mind of being this dude who wears a coat and gets on a boat with his Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, discovers the islands, and he does some trade. Whereas in reality, many people see Christopher Columbus as like this. This is a very brutal picture showing some of the treatment of the Taíno Indians that were living on the islands, or Taíno natives living on the island. At the time, Christopher Columbus and his soldiers were willing to hurt, maim, torture, kill even a lot of the Indian population to make them comply and do what he wanted and to bring him the goods that he wanted. And so many of the historians today view Christopher Columbus as not really a good guy, but more or less a brutal dictator that showed up to an island. And in later slides, we'll actually see how this devastation destroyed a large section of the New World by the Europeans' actions. Next, we have hemispheric links. Columbus tries 3 times. He never actually reaches Asia. I read an account where it says that he died believing possibly that he actually made it to India. He was very unclear if it was just him being kind of spacey near the end of his life. But Christopher Columbus wanted desperately to find that western route to India. He was very far off if you're thinking about the distance between, for example, where the Caribbean is and India is. That is like literally a world away. But by the early 16th century, several powers actually follow. A lot of European nations see what's happening in Portugal and hear about the adventures of Christopher Columbus and realize that their power is diminishing, their economic influence over all of Europe is diminishing. And so the English, the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch all decide to launch very large naval campaigns to get a lot of this trade done. There's also a realization of the value of newly discovered Americas. By discovering a whole new land, European explorers and traders see an area of untapped resources, possible new location of gold, other types of spices maybe people have never even seen or heard of, which is very true for these Europeans. And they're also hearing about a whole new group of people. For the Christian missionaries, they're seeing as another group of people that have never heard about Jesus. And so they're willing to get on boats, and the church is willing to fund some of these expeditions for the glory of God. And many of the European nations also see it as a place to expand their empires, because Europe at this point has pretty much set up their borders, and to change their borders required a lot of violence and war, which many European leaders did not see as a tenable situation. So they were willing to go out and try and find areas which were quote-unquote undiscovered or uninhabited and claim it as their own. Here's a map of European exploration in the Atlantic Ocean from 1486 to 1498. You can see Bartolomé Diaz, Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama's routes. And if you look at Columbus, he, traveled very extensively throughout the Caribbean. But if you look at the Portuguese routes, you can see that they actually pretty much stuck to their Atlantic and Indian Ocean routes very heavily, because they had set up a network that gained them a lot of goods and gained them a lot of money through this process. Then we get to the circumnavigation of the globe. Because Christopher Columbus has established that the world is larger than previously thought, and there's a whole section of the world that had never been encountered before, this is going to push a lot of explorers to try and find a way to actually circumnavigate or travel completely around the globe as an orb or as a sphere. Vasco Núñez de Balboa finds the Pacific Ocean while searching for gold in Panama. So he lands in Panama, travels across the whole of that section of the globe, and ends up running into another whole ocean, realizing that, there are actually two separate oceans, another ocean that they had never even thought of in the world up until this point. The distance to Asia is still unknown at this point, so he's not willing to just launch off and try and figure out how far to India, but he has discovered something very invaluable and very important to the process of circumnavigating the globe. Then we get Ferdinand Magellan, who is seen here on the left, not supported by the Portuguese, but sails in service of Spain. He sails through the Strait of Magellan, named after him, at the southern tip of South America, and his crew assailed by scurvy. Only 18 of 250 sailors returned to Spain from the journey. He was killed in local political dispute in the Philippines, but Magellan is seen as the first person, him and his crew, as being the first people to ever make it completely around the globe, even though he died in the Philippines. Next, we get exploration of the Pacific. The Spanish build Philippines-Mexico trade route. The connection between the Philippines and Mexico becomes a very large part of the Spanish Empire later on, and you can see it even today that the Philippines and Mexico still speak Spanish as a part of the long-term legacy of the colonization through that process. The English and Russians look for Northwest Passage to Asia. Most of the route is clogged by ice in the Antarctic Circle, so they're not really able to find a way to travel north to get to where they want to go, because their boats at this time are made of wood, and the freezing temperatures for their sailors are having a very difficult time making it through where they want to go. Norwegian Ronald Amundsen completes the route only in the 20th century, so we're going to keep him outside of our original chart, but he is one of the first people to actually complete the route in the 20th century with better technology, better sailing technology, better boats. Sir Francis Drake of England explores west coast of North America. He's kind of one of those people that is able to basically chart what we would know as like today California, Washington, Oregon area, and a little bit of northwest Canada. Vitus Bering from Russia sails through the Bering Strait, very important location for oceanic travel. And James Cook of England explores the southern Pacific. South Pacific area is like Samoa, the Hawaiian Islands, a lot of those little islands that you would think of in terms of being like tropical. Here's the European exploration, Cook's Voyages in the Pacific Ocean from 1519 to 1780, and Magellan's Voyages. If you look at this map, it's very, very squiggly, I think is the best word to use. Many of these people did not have a established understanding of the currents, of the winds, and so if you try and figure out what they're looking for, you're going to kind of have a very hard time finding what you want. If you think about it as well, there are no maps of these areas, so many of them are actually just wandering around looking to find whatever they can find and claim it for themselves. So if you look at the route of Ferdinand Magellan, for example, the blue one, it leaves from Lisbon, it travels down past the Strait of Magellan, it goes up and it goes across, it ends up in Guam, the Philippines, where Magellan will die. It continues through the Philippines, goes all the way around, goes down to the Cape of Good Hope, and they make it all the way back to Lisbon, the first circumnavigation of the globe. If you look at the first route of James Cook, which is in purple, you can see, where did he go? Okay, so he launches from London, travels in the squiggly line, going around Cape of Good Hope, ends up in what would be like today the Philippines, Indonesia area. He travels to like the northern-ish tip of Australia and travels all around New Zealand, circumnavigating New Zealand, and returns home. So this is a very important change in our understanding of the world because it's the first time that the humans have almost fully mapped out the distance of their Earth. And by doing so, they've kind of shown the limits of what there is to have or to be held by people. This changes dramatically Europeans' understanding of their place in it, and it also gives them this desire to go out and try and find more goods and more people to be a part of their empires. We then get to the establishment of trading post empires. Not only were empires being built by the Europeans as a country or as like an empire itself, but the trading post empires are becoming rival in and of themselves because of the money and influence they're able to exert over the local populations and the merchants themselves. The Portuguese are the first to set up trading posts, 50 by the mid-16th century, not to establish trade monopolies, rather to charge duties. If you think about it, you could be really good at establishing a monopoly on something and making a ton of money. For example, driver's licenses. Driver's licenses are a monopoly because they are held by the government. You can't get a driver's license from any other organization to drive within, for example, the state of California, unless you go to the California DMV or to a state within the union that recognizes California state driver's licenses, which are 99.9, actually 100% of them. And so by not establishing trade monopolies but charging duties, the Portuguese don't even have to do any work. When you show up with goods, if you want the right to trade, you have to pay to have the right to trade. And if you're going to take goods from a certain area, you got to pay to take them wherever you want them to go. This is very profitable because you don't need to create any boats. You really just collect money for the right of people to use your trading posts or use your area to trade with the locals of that area. Alfonso de Albuquerque, a major naval commander, he is the architect of trade duty policies, and violators would have their hands amputated. It's a very easy system. You want people to pay, you have to threaten them with violence if they don't want to cooperate, and Albuquerque is willing to go so far as to cut off your hand if you're found in violation of not paying your duty. So Albuquerque makes a very simple proposition to the people. You want to make money? Pay me. And if you want to try and make money without paying me, well, you're going to lose your hands. And this is a very good motivator for most people. I think that if in a similar circumstance, many of us would rather just pay a little bit, make our money, and leave rather than lose our hands. Yet, Arab traders continue to operate. They're able to operate because of Dar al-Islam. The overarching protection that comes from the empires of Islam are able to actually kind of buttress up against the trading post empires that are created. Many people would agree that if you want to do something and you're willing to do anything to accomplish that goal, if you're willing to even go so far as use violence, you probably could be able to do it. If you have the threat of having your hands chopped off by Alfonso de Albuquerque, but you're a Muslim and you have the protection of your tribe or even from the larger Islamic empires that will protect you, you're going to pretty much do whatever you want, ignoring those people, because you're willing to basically fight for your right to trade. The Portuguese control declines by the end of the 16th century because of the proliferation of other European nations into the trading of goods across the globe. The Portuguese, being as small as they are, really lose influence and dominance because many European nations devote a large section of their monies to trade and to the global trade network. English and Dutch trading posts. There was rival parallel trading networks between the Dutch and the English. The English trade concentrate on Indian trade in India, and the Dutch in Cape Town, Colombo, and Southern Pacific. Cape Town, South Africa, and the Southern Pacific areas. Basically, they're rivals because they're trying to get the same goods. They're also rivals in the fact that they're trying to dominate similar areas, and so there were wars, there was fighting over these lands, and eventually they kind of lead to having parallel trading networks, trade networks that travel on the same routes. They're trading the same goods but going to different locations. Next, we have European trading posts in Africa and Asia about 1700. If you look at these purple squares, those are the Dutch trading posts. You see the Spanish trading posts in green, the English trading posts in blue, French in yellow, Portuguese in orange. If you look at the map, one of the things you can immediately notice is that there isn't really a ton of overlap. There's a small part in Madras and Pondicherry, but for the most part, they pretty much stayed out of each other's way because making money is a very efficient way to prevent wars. If you think about someone that you would be working with, for example, in the classroom, if you both are working on a project and you're just trying to get through the project to get the grade, even if you don't like that person very much, it's not worth fighting and having problems and possibly failing the assignment. It's better just to get along and put your debates and fights on the back burner. That's kind of what the Europeans were seeing as the world kind of grew in their discovery and understanding of it. They're able to just kind of put aside their differences on the trade routes to be able to make money, because that's essentially what they really just want to do at the end of the day. Then there's the establishment of trading companies. The advantage of the Dutch and English over the Portuguese, by creating trading companies that are able to collect large amounts of investments from people, individuals, to fund a company that is able to go out and do trading. This creates for people this really advantageous position for the average person with enough money to join in on the trade. You don't have to buy your own boat. You could be an investor. You don't have to know anything about sailing. You just have to find somebody who does, give them lots of money, and then they will give you a cut of whatever it is that they go and sell and trade. The English set up the East India Company, established in 1600, and the Dutch United East India Company, or the VOC as it will be known, is established in 1602. What's great about this situation for the Dutch and the English specifically are that these are privately owned ships. Because they're privately owned, the government is spending very little money building its own ships to be launched for trade. You lose a ship, that's a loss to the investors, not a loss to the Empire of England or the Empire of the Dutch. What ends up happening is these investors are looking for a return on investment. It's the same thing today as with like the stock market, for example. But the government is able to support these ships through the building of the military, through naval power, specifically the English. The English will become one of the most dominant forces in the world, especially with their navy, because of their ability to divert their funds from trading and trying to make money through trading, and instead letting private investors work on making money and paying taxes, which then go to fund the military, which the military can serve double duty. It can protect the privately owned ships, but it can also fight wars or actually attack other countries that are trying to raid their ships, or even pirates, for example. And yes, at this time there were pirates. They were empowered with the right to engage in trade, build posts, and even make war. This is unheard of in today's society and in today's world, but these trading companies were able to basically start wars with whoever they interacted with, because the British and the Dutch saw the value in allowing this trade process to continue on. It was exceptionally profitable because with private investors looking to get rich, many people were willing to give more money than could be individually collected by an individual person. If we think back to Christopher Columbus and some of the other explorers, they were looking for individuals and small groups of people to fund their voyages. With these trading companies, you can go and buy a stock or whatever and buy a share from those trading companies. And when the trade comes in and they would give you a predictable date of 6-7 months from now, you come back, you give us $100, for example, we will give you $120, for example. And that was seen as extremely profitable because the average person could go and turn in their money and get some sort of share in that process. Now, again, this is reserved only for the wealthy and those of the middle class or upper middle class status. This isn't for every individual person, but it is extremely profitable for those people. Next, we have the European conquest in Southeast Asia. Spanish conquer the Philippines and name them after King Philip II. That's where we get the Philippines. Manila becomes a major port city. The influx of Chinese traders, highly resented by the Spanish and Filipinos. Basically, because the Philippines are located where they are, the Chinese were already doing their own trading on a small scale within the region of Southeast Asia. When the Spanish show up, these Chinese traders and the locals are actually fighting, not in physical combat, but they're very angry with one another for their trying to take away their market share or their money. Because if you have a rival company trading, you're going to have to lower your prices to compete. And this is going to lower their profits. Frequent massacres throughout the 17th up to 19th century. Like I said before, they weren't really physically fighting all the time, but when they did break out, there were massacres of one group or another. From the 17th to the 19th century, people were willing to shoot each other, kill each other, all over the name of money. There was also significant missionary activity. To this day, there is a large Catholic population in the Philippines because of the Spanish missionaries that were willing to come over with Catholicism to Southeast Asia and specifically the Philippines. The Dutch concentrate on the spice trade in Indonesia. They established the city of Batavia, which is here on the left, which is modern-day Jakarta. It's a trading post in Java. There's less missionary activity there. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this is that the Dutch were very, very, very concerned with making money. The Dutch are some of the few traders from Europe that are allowed to trade with Japan. Japan had isolated itself, and we'll talk about this a little later, for many centuries because they believed that they had no need of any other cultures and no need of any other cultures' goods. And the Dutch were given the permission by Japan to actually trade with them because they were willing to do pretty much anything to make money. And so since the Dutch are not willing to bring in missionaries, they're not willing to are not wanting to bring in missionaries, and they're not wanting to really change and influence the culture. They just want to make money. Many of the cultures that are willing to dip their toe in the water of trade are willing to allow the Dutch in. Next, we get Russian expansion in Asia. Russians take over the Mongol Khanates in the 16th century, so bye-bye Mongols. Astrakhan becomes a major trading city. It's still a very large, beautiful city to this day. The Caucasus are absorbed in the 18th century into the Russian Empire. Siberian expansions in the 16th to 17th century. We're going to talk about Siberia in a couple minutes. Trade with indigenous Siberian peoples. Many of this is like holdovers from the Khanates, from the Mongols, and they never really interacted or were absorbed into Asia. In many ways, Siberia was part of Eastern Asia culturally, and there was little success with missionary efforts, and there were some local rebellions. Because Siberia is so frickin' cold, it is very difficult to conquer those areas. It's very difficult to fight in those areas. And it's also very far away. Russia has a land size that is very, very large. And by this point, if you're talking about the whole of Russia, from Moscow all the way to the edge of Siberia, Russia pretty much covers more than half the globe in length. So the ability to control an empire that large from Russia, from as far away in the west as Moscow, is going to create a very difficult situation for the Russians, but they're going to try and do it, and there are some local rebellions that do pop up. The Russians occupy Siberia. Criminals originally and prisoners of war are originally exiled to Siberia because it's just kind of like send them very far away to a terrible place. The disgruntled peasants, they migrate east as well. If you were frustrated with the system of feudalism that was set up in Russia at the time, you could move east to where the land was basically free from the lords that were running it, and you wouldn't have to pay any taxes or fidelity to the lords. Trading posts develop along a specific route into Siberia, and the Russian population expands dramatically. In 1763, 420,000 Russians are in Siberia and outnumber the indigenous people 2-1. This is going to lead to large-scale conflicts. In the picture here, we have Russians showing up with their guns, fighting against pretty much the indigenous peoples. If you look in the picture, it's very clear that the technology of the gun is pretty much going to dominate in Siberia. You don't need to be very close to use a gun. You can be actually very far away, and it's actually advantageous to be farther away from your enemy with a gun than it is with them with their swords. This is going to cause huge problems as the Russians are able to pretty much sweep away a large number of the indigenous peoples. Here's a Russian conflict village in Siberia. Conflict villages are seen as places of conflict, but also kind of like a very far-flung, not really well-developed area of Russia. Siberia to this day isn't really a well-developed area. It is not a place seen as a desirable location, and many of the later Russian communist regimes will use Siberia for prisons and gulags where people are just kind of left and forgotten to die. Then we get to the 7 Years' War. It's 1756 to 1763. There are commercial rivalries between the empires at sea. We talked about how their main goal was desire to make money. Now, this commercial rivalry of making money does end up in shots being fired, and the 7 Years' War is an extension of what is known as the French and Indian War in the Americas, especially in Northeast America, where the colonists have landed, like where the American Revolution is taking place. George Washington was actually part of the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War is pretty much about how do the Europeans split up the rest of the world. They had a very specific vision of the world, many Europeans, that God, as a result of Christianity and blessing them with the awesomeness that is Europe, many of the Europeans believed that God had given the world to them, and it was their right and also their duty to actually go out and conquer those lands or claim those lands for themselves and to spread across the earth. It didn't matter who was there. It didn't matter what was there. It didn't matter what environmental damage was going to be taking place. They just believed they needed to spread out and take over. And so the only real conflict that was left with this ideology was who should have what. And so there's a 7 Years' War that's fought as this process happens. This is considered one of the first global wars. Global conflict erupts multiple theaters in Europe, India, the Caribbean, and North America. North America, like I said, emerges with the French and Indian War in 1754 and 1763. The British emerge victorious and establish primacy in India and Canada. To this day, Canada still holds a legacy of being a British colony, and India still has a large population that speaks English, and relations between India and Great Britain are still, tenuous at best, but they are very closely aligned because of this process, and Canada and Britain, very strong allies all the way since the inception of Canada. Here, I kind of want to take a moment because we're going to talk about a very specific and very strange thing that happened. It's more of an idea rather than a set of events. The Columbian Exchange was a very specific thing that happened, and I need you to kind of get familiar with it before we continue on. So I made the bit.ly here. It's http://bit.ly/cc-ce-Toyama. So it's John Green talking on Crash Course. He's going to explain a little bit about what the Columbian Exchange was. If you'd like to pause the video here, open up a new tab, watch that. It's about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I forget exactly how long, but it's a pretty quick listen. And so go ahead and take a moment, watch that, and then come back and rejoin me when you're done with that. Cool. So now that you've heard a little bit from John Green, the Columbian Exchange, it was named for Christopher Columbus, not Columbia the country. It's basically the global diffusion of plants, crops, animals, human populations, and disease pathogens from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere and vice versa. This is the first time in human history that a whole new group of things were traveling to Europe and to the Americas. For example, if you look at my little picture that I got here from our CP textbook, you can see things like tobacco, pumpkins, turkey, quinine, which is actually an anti-malarial medicine to prevent mosquitoes from giving you malaria, sweet potatoes, squash, pineapples, avocados, peppers, cocoa beans, which makes chocolate, cassava, peanuts, potato, tomatoes, corn, beans, and vanilla all come from North America. So Europeans up until this point had either never seen these before or had very, 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 very limited interaction with any of these goods. While the Europeans brought over to the New World coffee beans, peaches and pears, olives, citrus fruits, bananas, the honeybee, sugarcane, onion, grains like wheat, rice, barley, oats, livestock like cattle, sheep, pigs, horses. Because I always like to stop here, then think, when we think about the Native Americans, what do we think of? Many times we think of them riding a horse with a bow and arrow or riding along the plains. That did not happen until after Christopher Columbus. The turnip, grapes, and then this is a big key thing that I want to focus on, disease. Specifically, smallpox, influenza, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough, typhus, and measles. These diseases travel from Europe over to the New World or to North America because the Europeans and many people in the Eastern Hemisphere of the world actually had antibodies to many of the diseases that had happened. If you think back to the bubonic plague, at a certain point, there's a critical mass that happens, and all the people who are going to die from that disease die from that disease. Humans naturally have some resistance to many diseases because of genetics and different mutations in the genes, and therefore don't die from it. And those that do almost die and survive have antibodies, and those antibodies oftentimes and are readily passed on to their children, preventing disease breakouts. But when we look at the North America exchange of the Columbian Exchange, the North Americans had never interacted with Europe all the way back into the Great Migrations that we talked about in like Chapter 1, when people crossed across the great land bridge between Russia and Alaska. And one of the things that happens is these populations in the Western Hemisphere are decimated. When by decimated, I mean reduced down by a tenth, and in many cases, actually, I don't know the exact word, but 90% of populations die. That is not a very good thing, obviously, and it's something that is still to this day discussed and is a problem because many people argue, did the Europeans know after first encountering the natives and realizing they were dying from many of the same diseases that they hadn't died from for hundreds of years, were the Europeans still creating pathways or creating situations where those diseases could be traded to the natives? It wasn't probably that the Europeans were actively coughing, for example, on the faces of the natives, but did the Europeans give goods that were maybe laced with some of those germs? Many of the Europeans did not have the knowledge of germ and pathogens and how diseases worked at this point, but it's still a controversy to this day for many historians. We then have links between previously independent biological zones. Like I said before, humans had not interacted between these two hemispheres of the world even after the melting of that land bridge, all the way back from Chapter 1, when people basically started walking upright and doing hunting and gathering. This permanently alters human geography and the natural environment. The natural environment in many ways changes dramatically as a result of this, and human geography, where people live, how they live, what types of people live, and we lose whole populations. For example, the Taino Indians that Christopher Columbus interacts with are actually pretty much wiped out to extinction as a result of this process. On a lighter note, however, I always like to point out that as a result of the Columbian Exchange, we have many of my favorite foods, like spaghetti. For Europeans, especially the Italians, they had never seen a tomato. And for many Europeans, they believed that tomatoes were poison. And in some accounts I've read before, some believe they were aphrodisiacs, meaning that they caused a person you liked or a person you wanted to fall in love with you. If they ate it, it would make them fall in love with you. But it's crazy to think that all the way up until basically 1492, your Italians didn't have tomatoes to make tomato sauce. So that's pretty crazy. And those of you in the Latin Americas, one of my favorite things is a torta. I think that's how you say it in the fancy Spanish that I can't speak. You don't have all the goods you need to make a torta. You need wheat, for example, to make bread. And you need avocado from, obviously, North America. And you need livestock, like you have to make that sweet, sweet asada to put on your torta, but you can't make it if there are no cattle, and they're all in Europe. So once they end up in the Americas, they're able to make tortas, which are my favorite things from Mexican food restaurants. We then get epidemic diseases and population decline. Like I said before, smallpox, huge destroyer of the populations of the natives living in the Americas. Also measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, influenza, the flu. There was no prior exposure to these diseases in Western Hemisphere or Oceania, which is the southeast area of the globe when we think about a normal globe. New Zealand, Australia, Southeast Asia, like the lower half of Southeast Asia, there was no inherited or acquired immunities, leading to a 1519 smallpox outbreak in the Aztec Empire. The population declines 90% within 100 years. From the Aztec Empire that we discussed, the very large, very influential, very powerful Aztec nation, 17 million people strong, drops to 1.3 million within only 100 years, all from epidemic diseases and also from the colonial powers shooting at them, specifically the Spanish with their swords and their guns. Next, we're going to look at some smallpox images. For those of you that are a little squeamish, I've learned that I probably should give some disclaimers on some of these pictures. They will kind of turn your stomach if you're not really prepared for them, so I'll let you know when you can look back at the screen, but go ahead and just listen along and take notes while I go over this. First up, we have signs and symptoms. When the pustules, which are little tiny bubbles on your skin, think like zits except for filled with blood, erupt, the skin does not break, but actually separates from its underlying layers. You know how your skin has 3 layers? First, second, third degree burns? The pain can be excruciating. Scabs begin to form 8 to 9 days later and eventually fall off, leaving deep pitted scars. All lesions in a given area progress at the same rate through these stages. People who don't recover usually die during the second week of illness. So here's our first picture. Super sad, super depressing, but also super gross. You can see that they're called smallpox or small pustules, or small pox are little tiny bubbles, basically. And you can see how they're pitted. You can see how they have basically scars underneath them. Eventually, these will rot and they will leave deep scars. And the people that do live are scarred for life. The people who don't live usually die within the second week, like I said before. Here's smallpox on the face of a child. It's very excruciating, very painful. Think about the worst like pain within your skin possible. Many of the patients in these images are basically on their last bit of life. Some of them are probably even dead. I think this man is dead. It's dominated his entire body, and he's now just a giant mess because of this disease. All right, so we're done with pictures. Next, we have the food crops and animals. The Columbian Exchange also increases the overall food supply. I love, love, love when we get a chance to talk about food in world history, because we have already established that when calorie counts increase, population counts increase, and by increasing the overall food supply, that is the calorie count increasing. The introduction of European animals to the Americas, like horses, cattle, pigs, chickens, create a surplus of different types of food, a plurality of food, a diversity of food. There's an introduction of American foods to Europe and Asia and Africa. Maize, for example, or modern day corn did not look like it did on, like, for example, the Thanksgiving dinner you either have or going to have this year. It looked a lot like little tiny brown speck-filled things. Like if you think about a cornucopia, which is around the time of Thanksgiving, they're the things that look kind of like little, I don't even know, like handheld, and they were hard, and they weren't really full of calories. They also didn't really taste great, but through selective breeding, we get to the corn of today. Potatoes are also something that show up from the Americas. What's great about potatoes is that many of the natives were able to actually preserve potatoes by essentially mashing them and storing them long term, because they don't really rot as efficiently through this process. Beans, another staple food of people around the world. They're very hardy. They grow plentifully. They have a lot of calories. They can get you through those times when you don't have a ton of food. You get the whole idea. Next, we have world population growth chart from 1500 to 1800 CE. 1500, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of like 275 million to 300 million. by 1800, it's approaching 900 million people. We're going to start to almost hit 1 billion people by the end of 1800. Next, we have migration. There was selective migration by the Europeans to move to the New World for goods or for profit, but there was also forced migration through the enslaved Africans to South America, North America, and the Caribbean. One of the big things that happens by the interaction of the Columbian Exchange is that the native populations die off. So many Europeans believe by going to the New World, establishing plantations or establishing whole large farms, they were able to make money by employing or forcing the natives to work on those farms. They would capture them and then force them to work to grow sugarcane, for example. There are horrible stories about slaves having their arms chopped off because of the rum production going bad and they get their arms stuck in machines. But the one big thing that happens is this native population, like I said, died. And so if you have a large native population dying, you need to replace that workforce because many of the Europeans did not believe that they needed to slave in the hot Caribbean sun. So they brought enslaved Africans to South America, North America, and the Caribbean to facilitate this process of making money on sugarcane, on rum, on other goods that would travel back from the Western Hemisphere or from the New World to Europe. The European pioneers also came looking for gold, looking for trading networks that they could establish in the New World. But this migration of enslaved Africans is one of the saddest parts in human history. Then we get the origins of global trade. This is the first global trade network established. Back in 2006, our DBQ was focused on the silver trade between the Spanish and Japan. And you can see that the Transoceanic trade in the Atlantic Ocean basin, meaning that it's trading across the globe through being facilitated through the Atlantic Ocean because many of the Europeans would go from their homes in Europe to the New World, land at trading posts, and bring the goods from the Western Hemisphere in North America and South America would be brought to trading posts on the coast. They would then load up with the goods from the Americas and give all the European goods to the people that were there and then take them back home. There were manufactured goods from Europe and raw goods from the Americas. Manufactured goods like clothing and guns and iron materials like steel swords, for example. Whereas raw goods like tobacco, which could be turned into cigarettes, were being brought from the Americas back to Europe. The Manila galleons, from 1565 to 1815, Spanish galleons dominate the Pacific Ocean trade. The great part about these galleons is they are super large and they are able to travel not as fast as some of the smaller ships, but they're able to hold a ton of goods. And by able to transport a large amount of goods very efficiently through the use of the boats, the Spanish are going to make a ton of money through this process. Chinese luxury goods for American raw materials, especially silver, are going to also be a part of this trade network. And we're going to look at this map real quick. You can see white represents the route of the Manila galleons in the Pacific and the flota in the Atlantic, smaller boats, while the blue represents these Portuguese routes. You can see they are finally traveling all over the world, moving back and forth between Southeast Asia, the Americas, across the Atlantic Ocean, along the Columbian Exchange, and we'll eventually get to what's called triangle trade, which will facilitate Europe working with Africa, working with as in enslaving the slaves in Africa, taking them to the New World, dropping off the slaves, picking up the raw goods to be taken back to Europe so that the finished or manufactured goods can be made in Europe. This is a global trade network for the first time in human history. Next, we're going to look at the environmental effects of global trade. Fur-bearing animals were hunted to extinction or near extinction. In North America, very famous example of like beavers, like the kind of little animals that build dams and chop up wood. They were hunted in Canada, especially in the regions of like Quebec and in Northeast America, Northeast Canada. There was also whales, codfish, other animals with industrial uses. Whales, because of their high blubber count and high fat content, were used for candles, for soap, anything that like you think of being made for cosmetic purposes as well. The waxiness of fat is what the whales were being harvested for. Here's a 18th century engraving of a Dutch whale hunt. It's a little bit later than what we're talking about, but you get the idea of people just going out and with harpoons and stabbing whales until they could drag them onto the boat, harvest them for their blubber, which would then be created into a manufactured good. And there was relentless human exploitation of the natural environment. There wasn't an understanding at this point in human history of protecting the environment. Again, going back to the European understanding of the world, they believed that it was theirs to dominate, to control, that God had created all this for them. And as a result, they could do what they will with the plants, the animals, the water, the resources, natural and human, however they saw fit. So we made it. When you have finished studying this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Explain the motives and key features of technology behind European maritime exploration and expansion. Why are people getting on boats? Why are the Europeans doing all this? What is the point? Next, compare and contrast key European explorations of the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans. Why are they trading in the Atlantic, and why are they trading in the Indian Oceans, and why are they trading in the Pacific Ocean, and what are they trading, and kind of who's really doing all that? That's kind of what I'm looking for there. Next, explain the origins and features of trading post empires. Why is this separate and unique from, say, a country that is being run as an empire? Next, compare and contrast Portuguese, English, Dutch conquests in Southeast Asia. I draw a little chart and just see where they overlap and where they don't overlap. Explain the development of the Russian Empire in Asia. What was Russia doing at this time? Russia isn't really joining in on this global trade network at this time. So what are they doing to kind of grow their empire? Next, understand and discuss the connections between commercial rivalries and the 7 Years' War. Why is this fighting happening? And why do people believe that it's so important to fight one another over what? Next, make sure you really understand this. Explain and identify key features of the Columbian Exchange. John Green did a great job of breaking it down. So if you haven't watched that video and you just completely skipped over it, I would make sure you watch it because he breaks it up into a couple different categories and explains them of how the Columbian Exchange changed our world for mostly the worse, but in some ways for the better. And finally, outline the origins of the global trade network. Where did it come from? Why did it happen? Give me kind of like a timeline of big important events. And then at this point, you should also double check that you have 10 explorers and 2 organizations on that separate sheet chart. For my students, this is a mandatory thing. I should probably see it on your notes. And if not, you're going to lose some points on that. For the rest of you all that are just joining in, I think it's something that's good to help you for your AP test that you're going to be taking in class on this chapter, and for sure it's going to help you long-term on that AP exam that we're going to be taking in May. As always, it's been great here to talk to you guys. It's time to reread, maybe for my students with the active reading strategies we discussed in class, just saying. But for the rest of you all, thank you for joining me. This is Mr. Toyama's AP World History. I'll see you next time. Bye.
What we do here is go back.